Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Canadian Public Sector webinar. I am Alexandra. I'll be the MC today. We're just going to give it a minute and let a few other registrants hop on. So we'll begin momentarily. I see we have a few more people. As I said, we're just going to wait a few more minutes and we'll begin momentarily. Who do you want to message? Hi, everyone. I see we have some more people joining. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Public Sector webinar. My name is Alexandra, and I will be your MC during this session. Thank you all for joining us today. We're a couple minutes behind, so we can start as people trickle in. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping rules first during the webinar. Everyone's microphones will be muted. However, the webinar is open discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded, so it will be sent to everyone via email tomorrow morning. One more thing that I'd like to note is that we are running a special promotion this summer, and those details are going to be given towards the end of the webinar. So we have a few more people that just came in. As I just mentioned, webinar is being recorded and we will share that tomorrow morning via email. Some background on who we are as a company. ExitCertified has been in the training industry for 20 years now. And the last 8 years, we have been focused on cloud training. We offer award-winning certified instructors, excellent virtual learning through our IMVP virtual platform, and continuous cycle of training and customer care. We're also fully versed in the administrative requirements of all levels of government in the US and Canada. Our dedicated government education service consultants can help you create a learning path that meets the needs of everyone on your team. So we hope you enjoy this webinar and consider us for your future training needs. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists for today's webinar, Miles Brown. Miles Brown is the Senior Cloud and DevOps Advisor at Tech Data ExitCertified. He has over 20 years of experience in the IT industry across a variety of platforms. He's recognized as an AWS Authorized Instructor Champion and a Google Cloud Platform Professional Architect and Instructor. Miles has been delivering award-winning authorized IT training for the biggest cloud providers. So with that said, Miles, please take it away.
All right, thanks, Alexandra. So we have upwards of an hour today to talk about the cloud. I think I called it the Cloud Comparison 2022, State of AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. So this is sort of what I thought we would do for an outline, talk a little bit about the models of cloud services, what kind of workloads people run in the cloud, and then get into a bit of a overview of the various, or at least the big three public cloud providers, and try and make the case for each one. What do they do well? What do they not do so well? And then we'll talk a little bit about hybrid and multi-cloud architectures. And what I thought we'd finish up with is this idea that when you move to the cloud, it's generally not just, oh, I need to go take some classes in AWS or Azure. There's usually a lot going on when you do a cloud transformation. And there's a whole bunch of different kinds of technologies and practices that you might be embracing all at once. So to take a look at some of the things that commonly happen when people move to the cloud. And at ExitCertified, we're a training company. So we tried to sort of build one diagram. We call it the cloud centrics diagram to show, in the middle, you've got, yes, classes, authorized classes from the public cloud vendors, but around that, there's this whole ecosystem of technologies and practices that you may need to learn. Not everybody needs to learn all of them, but we'll take a look at what's out there. So we'd start with the models of cloud services. You may have heard these terms before: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. If you haven't, it's basically trying to describe whose responsibility is it for taking care of part of that IT stack. So before the cloud, you were running on premises in your own data centers. Everything was on you to manage, right? So say something like a database, you had to, have the servers and the networking and everything, and then you had to install and patch and maintain an operating system, and then install the database on top of that and patch that and take backups and all the stuff involved in administration. When you move to the cloud, at the very first level of the cloud is what some people call infrastructure as a service. That's where we say, just give me a virtual machine and let me do what I want with the virtual machine, right? That's where most people start with the cloud. They look at it and they say, okay, in AWS, it's called an EC2 instance. In Google Cloud and Azure, they just call them VMs, because that's what it is. It's a virtual machine. And so I say, hey, go launch a virtual machine that looks like this. And so everything up to and including the installation of the OS is done by the cloud vendor, right? And so you're going to get some Linux or Windows machine that you're able to remote into if you want. You can SSH into Linux. You can use RDP to get into Windows. And then you've got an operating system that you have to maintain, but you can treat it however you've always treated your virtual machines, right? And so that's the first level of cloud. The next level of cloud is what we might call PaaS, or platform as a service. And that's where the cloud vendor looks and says, maybe we can do more for you than just take care of the physical machines in our data centers. Maybe we can take care of your operating system, your file system, installation of software, take it up a notch. So we're going to take a look at some different PaaS offerings. And so that's really where most of these big three cloud vendors play, is infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Now, the highest level of a cloud model is called software as a service, or SaaS, some people say. And this is where something like Salesforce.com, where I don't really manage anything. I might be able to tweak what the UI looks like a little bit and decide what reports I want, but I'm not in charge of any of the hardware or the software, or even where the data lives. All of that is the cloud vendor. And so public cloud providers are usually focused on infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. There are some things like Microsoft Office 365 or Google's G Suite, or whatever they're calling it today. Things like Dropbox, those are software as a service. And we're not really going to talk too much about those. We're really concentrating on the infrastructure and platform as a service. So a good example of a platform as a service is something like, I need a relational database, and so in the AWS world, they've got a service called RDS, the Relational Database Service. And so what they do is they say, for a small set of database engines, so they started with the two most popular commercial databases, Oracle and SQL Server, and the two most popular open source ones, MySQL and Postgres. And they said, for this small set of database engines, we'll be your DBA. It's an interesting trade-off, right? You're saying, okay, I'm going to let a brainless algorithm at Amazon be my DBA. What a trade-off, right? I no longer have to do all those low-level DBA duties, but I also don't really have control over the database like I normally would. And so I'm sort of at the mercy of how they do administration. And in the end, I'm just a user. I get a JDBC or an ODBC driver. I can connect to the database, create my tables, decide on indexes and where to put partitioning and things like that. But that's about it. I don't have any access to that virtual machine or the operating system of it. And so it's an interesting trade-off. Not everybody likes it, right? Some people love this idea. If you got a bunch of developers, not a lot of DBA talent, this will keep your database up and running and taking nightly backups and maybe doing, a second database that we're doing replication to, they can take care of all that. But if you say, no, I've got a very specific way I like to do things, I don't want this, well, then that's fine. You can just launch virtual machines and install and configure and manage your database the way you want. So you got kind of the best of both worlds. So that's an example of a PaaS offering from AWS. From another example from Azure would be something like the Azure App Service. This makes it really easy if you're a .NET developer and you've built an application. Maybe you've got a zipped up, .NET app, a web app, and you say, hey, I want to launch this, but I don't want to really think about, how many servers do we need and when do we need to grow and shrink that cluster of machines. I want Azure to take care of the auto scaling, high availability. I'm just going to point them to, okay, here's my GitHub repository where my code is. Go grab that and make a scalable web infrastructure for me. Okay? So there's a lot of these kinds of platform as a service. And what they really start to do is change, what is the role of the cloud vendor? It's not just taking care of our data centers for us. They're providing more and more. And there's sort of a newest model, which you might call function as a service, or FaaS. I've also seen it called function platform as a service, or FPaaS. I think Gartner calls it that. And the idea here is it's very developer centric. You say, I'm a developer, and I'm gonna build an application in an event driven way, but I don't want to have to think about servers at all, right? I write some code, I configure what is the event that causes this code to run, and then I just pay for how long that code runs, right? So AWS has really popularized this with AWS Lambda. So the developers provide code and configure the event that triggers it. They don't worry about servers, operating systems, high availability, deployment, any of that. And all they pay for is 1 millisecond increments of how long that function runs, right? Rather than saying, okay, I got to launch X number of servers and think about, okay, well, I need to patch them over time. I need to make sure that if one dies, it gets replaced. I don't have to think about any of that. And of course, over the years, whenever one of the big three cloud vendors comes up with a good idea, what happens? Everybody else says, hey, let's do that exact same thing. So Azure has Azure functions, Google Cloud has Google Cloud functions, very, very similar concepts, right? So this idea of serverless is becoming very sexy, right? And that's one kind of way that people are using the cloud. But in general, there's a few different kinds of workloads that you commonly see people use in the cloud. So let's take a look at those. What are organizations? What are people running in the cloud? A lot of times you might start with the cloud just because you bought some off-the-shelf software that runs in Azure, right? So you say, okay, well, we got to get Azure so we can run this software. That's sometimes people's, introduction to the cloud. But if you're really looking and saying, no, we're thinking about really dipping our toes into the cloud. We're going to run some of our workloads in the cloud. Well, then usually you start by taking some, simple apps, maybe non-mission critical apps, dev and test, maybe some simple web apps that are sort of isolated. And you say, let's move those to the cloud. Sometimes we call it lift and shift, where we just say, let's take what we have running on our own data center, set up virtual machines that look the same in the cloud, and just kind of plop it over there. The problem with that, it gets your toes in the cloud right away, but you don't really get all the advantages of the cloud. It probably is not designed because it wasn't built for the cloud. It's probably not going to get the same kind of scale and flexibility that applications that are cloud native have. And so a lot of companies, that we talked to over the last, say, 7-8 years, they started just by doing lift and shift. And then they started to say, now we want to build apps specifically for the cloud. And so when we talk about cloud native apps, that's there's actually a consortium called the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, where they sort of set out, here's what it means for an application to be cloud native. It usually means that we've designed it in a way so that it can take full advantage of the cloud. Now, one of the ways that we implement cloud native is by containerizing applications. So you probably heard of Docker containers. Docker really changed the game back in 2013 when it came out and made it easy to build a container where we've got the code and all its dependencies in a nice portable way. I can run it on my laptop. It runs the same as if I run it on my servers in my data center, or if I run it in AWS or Azure, Google Cloud, wherever. And so what a lot of people do is they start to take big monolithic apps and break them up into microservices, and they implement each microservice with a little container. Right? The problem then becomes, how do you keep track of hundreds or even thousands of these containers? We need some sort of orchestration tool. And there's a few different orchestration tools out there for containers, but the one that sort of became the de facto standard is called Kubernetes. So you probably heard that term thrown around. And so a lot of people, especially if they're in a hybrid way where they're running some things in their own data centers and some things in the cloud, by using Kubernetes, you can sort of say, well, I've got kind of a consistent experience no matter where I am. And so that's a very popular way to build cloud native apps these days. And the other one we mentioned already is the idea of serverless architectures. So a lot of companies, their entire goal of using the cloud is to say, you know what, I never really liked doing a whole bunch of Linux administration in the first place. So if I can cut that out, if I can have sort of a web front end, and then my business logic is implemented a bunch of these little serverless functions, and then it talks to some managed databases in the back, then you look across the whole stack and you say, where am I doing Linux or Windows administration? I'm not, right? That's very attractive for some companies. And so they might start with new applications in the cloud using serverless. I guess the last kind of major workload that we see in the cloud is, well, once you have any of these apps running in the cloud, you realize that you're generating a lot of data, right? And it's stored somewhere, centrally. All the cloud vendors have some sort of a large cloud object storage or blob storage. And so it's a nice central place where you grab all this data and you throw it all in one place and you say, hey, now that I look and I can see how much data I have in one place, this is where I might want to be doing my analytics. And so doing all kinds of analytics, whether it's just, building a data warehouse with all this centralized data and then, attaching BI tools and, building dashboards or reports or whatever, or if you go further and you get into machine learning and AI and doing some really interesting data science on that data, the cloud really fits well with big data because, we have this sort of unlimited scale in the cloud, which is really handy because, when we get a lot of data, doing things in parallel across a bunch of machines is really the way to speed things up. And so, that's another popular workload that people are running in the cloud, is analytics. So let's talk a little bit about the major public cloud providers. We'll look at sort of the timeline of when they popped up. Things really got going with AWS back in 2006, although you could say that, some of the services predated that, but 2006 is when EC2, which is our main virtual machine, and S3 came out. And so that's when they spun it off as its own company and said, okay, this is a product. So that makes it the most popular and the most mature. They got such a head start because Azure and Google Cloud didn't come out till 2010, 2011. So AWS enjoyed quite a, market share because they got out first, right? Now, Azure is the second most popular. It's very popular with companies that are already a Microsoft shop, right? So if you're doing .NET development, using SQL Server, you don't do a lot of Linux, it might be a no-brainer that you go into Azure because of some of those platform as a service that are really set up nicely for .NET apps and running SQL Server for you. Google Cloud is very popular with machine learning and artificial intelligence people, and we'll see why. But it is not super popular across the board. We'll look at sort of the numbers in a minute. Some other players in the field are IBM Cloud and Oracle Cloud. IBM Cloud is maybe popular if you're 100% IBM shop, you're just running IBM stuff in the cloud. But otherwise, I don't think it's all that great for just general, IT stuff. And Oracle Cloud, kind of similar idea. So they came a little later and they're a little more niche. Now, there are a couple other big players in China, And so you see Alibaba Cloud and Tencent Cloud are they pop up on the worldwide Magic Quadrant that Gartner puts out of who are the leaders in public cloud. So this is the one from last year. The 2022 probably comes out in a month or two. And according to Gartner, AWS continues to be the best in its ability to execute. But Azure and Google Cloud have snuck up into that top right quadrant. It took them years to get there, but they're there, right? And so that's sort of what Gartner says is the best at executing their vision, right? What about the numbers? Here's I've seen numbers kind of like this a few times, always somewhere in these ranges, where 33% of the market is AWS, 20 to 21% is Azure, around 10% is Google Cloud, and then a lot of other players. Certainly the Chinese players are very popular in China, right? So that's, I would say that Azure's gained quite a bit in the last 5 years. They're really coming along. But that's, that head start that AWS had is still, keeping them very popular. Now let's talk a little bit about the infrastructure that they have. I just want to get some terminology out there so then we can talk specifically about Canada and what's there. So in AWS, when they build a data center, they don't typically just build one, they'll build a few right beside each other. And then miles down the road, they'll build another cluster of data centers, right? And each of those clusters is called an availability zone, or AZ, right? And the idea is that, these AZs are far enough apart that, they should be independently available from one another, right? So the cluster of machines that make up one AZ, it could be just one data center, it could be a bunch. They look like one, right? But then miles down the road, there's another availability zone, and it's close enough together that AWS can put very low latency, high throughput lines between them, right? So we're talking all of the AZs that make up one region are definitely within 100 miles of one another, right? But far enough apart that hopefully they are independent. If some disaster takes out this cluster of data centers, this other one a few towns over should be safe. So what are we talking about? They put them in different floodplains. They put them on different sides of fault lines. They try and attach them to different electricity grids if they can. They certainly have different independent power supplies and generators and all that kind of thing. Now, AWS currently has 26 regions around the world, and within those, there's 84 availability zones. And they have a map. If you click on this will take you to the updated map that shows you, here's the ones that are here now are in green, and the orange ones are coming soon. So we have one coming in Calgary soon. We'll talk about that in a minute. In Azure, they also have this concept of regions and zones. They have 59 regions. Some of those are then decomposed into multiple zones. They don't really call them AZs, they call them zones. But sometimes in Azure, a region can be as small as one data center. So Azure was able to get out there very quickly and get into many, many countries before anybody else could, because sometimes their infrastructure is maybe just one data center, right? So they group their regions into geographies that share data residency, sovereignty, compliance, things like that. And so they have a similar kind of global infrastructure page that you can go look at. They talk a lot about the sustainability. They all kind of talk about that now. But if you go to the geographies, you can look, for each one. So starting here in Canada, we've got 2 regions, Toronto and Quebec City. If you look at the US, they've got a lot more, obviously. And so that tells you a little bit about, it's kind of a similar idea, although they might have a region that is not, truly highly available, could be just one data center. Google Cloud basically used almost the exact same terminology, same setup as AWS. They have 34 regions made up of 103 zones. They're very vocal about their vast network infrastructure, where they talk about, what kind of lines they have between these regions, so moving data around. And then they also have a similar kind of document where they talk about the regions and zones, and they all kind of have the same kind of idea, right? So that's a little bit. Now, if we look specifically at Canada, right now, AWS only has one region. And it opened up in late 2016 in Montreal, or near Montreal, they say. It's got 3 AZ, so it's a full-blown region. And there's another one coming soon. Now, when they say coming soon, what they've advertised is probably late 2023 or early 2024, right? And it'll, again, be a full, 3 AZ zone. Azure had 2 regions back in 2016. So they started one in Toronto, has 3 zones, and they started one in Quebec City, but it doesn't have zones. So it's not what, the other cloud vendors would call a region, right? It's very much, a scaled down version of that. Google Cloud got to Canada a little later. They started with their Montreal region in 2018, and then just last year, they opened the Toronto region. So they're the only ones that have like a full 2 region setup in Canada right now. Now, why would I want specifically to run my stuff in Canada? Well, because data sovereignty laws. There's certain data that must be held in Canada. Or if you used a US region, it wouldn't be the end of the world, maybe depending on your compliance, but maybe then that data is subject to the Patriot Act or something like that, where you're like, I'm not comfortable with that, right? So there's lots of reasons to pick a particular region. Usually it's got to do with, well, first off, you're picking a region to run your resources probably based on latency, right? If all your customers are in Canada, most of them are in, the east coast of Canada, well, then you're probably going to pick a region somewhere in the east, so that very low latency if you're trying to do web apps or whatever. So the latency is the first one. The data sovereignty laws is another one. Not every region has every service, so you have to pick one that has the right services. And then the pricing can differ from one region to another. So you got a few things that go into deciding what region, where do you want to run things. So given all these choices, what's the case for each cloud provider? Well, let's start with AWS. First off, it's popular because it's popular, right? It's the oldest, the most popular. There's the most information out there on it. There's the most practitioners. If you're trying to hire somebody, chances are they used it in college. They can know a little bit about AWS. It's easier to hire somebody that knows it. I would say, and I don't have good numbers on this, but I used to have good numbers, but all the companies that kept downtime or uptime numbers on the big cloud providers, they're not doing it anymore. So it's hard to find this information, but it seems to me that AWS has the least amount of downtime. Now, they have the most public failures because when AWS is down, half the internet is down, right? And so in 2021, there was a couple things that happened, and then one big one in 2017, and then back in 2012, there was a big event. And so, it only happens once in a while, but it's very high profile because so many web companies are all in on AWS that, you notice a lot of websites aren't working today, right? And so, but I would say that, on a day-to-day basis, they seem to have the best uptime of all the 3 major vendors. They tend to have the best overall breadth and depth of services, over 200 plus services across, everything you want. They've got the most mature and popular serverless option, which is AWS Lambda. Now, I mentioned that Azure is really coming along. So one of the reasons for that is that it's usually easy to embrace Azure because a lot of enterprises already are using Office 365. So we're already in Microsoft's cloud, right? And we already have some sort of enterprise agreements with them. And so we just add to that. If you're a .NET shop, I would say it's a no-brainer. They got a great PaaS offering for that. Azure is very popular in hybrid organizations. There's something called Azure Stack. So it's sort of a hardware and software that you can put in your own data center and run the exact same Azure services, but run them in your own data center rather than, and so that might change things for compliance reasons. Now, they're not alone in having some sort of a hybrid idea. AWS has something called AWS Outposts, but it tends to be super expensive. They've come in with a cheaper version, but it's not taking off yet. And Google Cloud has something called Anthos, which kind of helps with that sort of a hybrid environment, but only if you're doing a lot of Kubernetes stuff. So it's very specific. Why Azure? Well, Azure got very popular because they had a presence in many countries before some of the others. So specifically in Canada, they were the first ones here. And they put up 2 regions in 2016 before AWS was even up and running, right? So they did capture some of that Canadian cloud market right away, right? Why Google Cloud? Well, if you're really into machine learning and artificial intelligence, they do a pretty good job of that. Now, everybody's got lots of services for machine learning, but Google Cloud, they built TensorFlow. Like, so at Google, they do a lot of the innovation. They come up with some ideas, they make it open source, that gets popular. So TensorFlow, they built based on their deep expertise of research and development into machine learning. So obviously they do a pretty good job of managing TensorFlow type machine learning environments. So they do a good job of that. They also built Kubernetes. That was internally something at Google that was built and then open source. And so they do a great job of managing Kubernetes. So there is a service they have called GKE, the Google Kubernetes Engine. But not to be left behind, Azure has AKS, the Azure Kubernetes Service. AWS has EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service. So they all have sort of the same stuff. It's just who does what the best, you know? Google Cloud probably has about the cheapest pricing, but when you're trying to compare pricing, it's very difficult because large organizations, when they go into the cloud, they usually negotiate some sort of an enterprise agreement and say, hey, if we're going to spend this much a month, you better give us a better rate than the retail rate, right? And so there's all kinds of volume discounts. It's really hard to say which one's the cheapest, but Google Cloud tends to be that. What I would say the downside of Google Cloud is that they tend to deprecate things a little more often than, well, certainly than AWS. When AWS puts out a service, they're going to continue to use it. As long as customers are using it, they're going to maintain that. And I found that Google Cloud has sort of changed directions a few times over the years. And so if you've got a lot of code written and then all of a sudden they change how they do things, you're like, oh, I'm kind of left holding the bag. So that's sort of a knock against Google Cloud. They do have Anthos for hybrid and multi-cloud environments, but it's very much tied up with Kubernetes. So you better be doing that. Now, these days, if you look across the Canadian federal government, they basically say you can use any of these clouds. You can use multiple clouds, right? They're not tying you to just one. And so it's probably worth talking a little bit about this concept of hybrid and multi-cloud and see what are people doing with that. Is it really a big deal? So this is from last year. There was a report. This company Flexera does a huge poll of lots of IT managers and says, hey, what are you doing? And so they asked, what percentage of people are doing sort of what you might call multi-cloud? Right? Multi-cloud is kind of a misnomer here. Maybe it could be multiple public clouds, or it could mean you have at least one public and one private cloud in your own on-prem data centers. So you might set up VMware or something like that in your own data centers, and then you still have that sort of on-demand, provisioning of resources. So you call that a private cloud. And so they said very few people are doing just a single private cloud or just a single public cloud. Most people are in this sort of hybrid way. And if you think about it, if I've already got data centers and you say, hey, we want to go to the cloud, you already paid for these data centers. That's some cost, right? You want to leverage those if you can. And so what you might use is the cloud for any new development. And then over time, when your old data center starts to get old, the equipment in it is end of life, and you start looking and saying, do I want to replace this, or do I just want to use the cloud more now that I know how the cloud works? And so a lot of companies, for the foreseeable future, are in this hybrid environment where they're running some workloads in their own data centers and some in the cloud. Right? Not that many running multiple public clouds. So hybrid cloud is a way to ease into the use of public cloud while still leveraging your existing data center investment. One term you might run into is something called cloud bursting. This is where you primarily run workloads in your private cloud, but then you utilize a public cloud provider when you need excess capacity, right? So right now we're using Zoom. That's our platform that we use for webinars. We also use Zoom for our regular classes, although in a regular class, it's different than this. You're encouraged to keep your camera on, and it's, two-way, kind of like a real classroom. We've been using Zoom since it first came out in 2014. And so we talked to Zoom early on, and they told us they were running their own data centers, but they used AWS as a backup. And then eventually they had to add in all kinds of public cloud providers as backup, not as backup, but as excess capacity. And certainly as the pandemic started and, a lot of people started using Zoom, they definitely needed that excess capacity of public cloud. Now, when people really talk about, hey, we're in multi-cloud, what they're probably saying is that we're using multiple public clouds, right? And there's different reasons for that, right? One reason might be I want to avoid vendor lock-in, right? So there's this sort of idea that if I can move my applications to any cloud, then, if cloud ABC decides to change their pricing, well, then I can go run it somewhere else. That one's tough, because what ends up happening is if you try and make an application that can run in any cloud, then you basically have to use the lowest common denominator. What are the basic features? If you think of the cloud as just, hey, I need some compute, some networking, and some storage, that's the basic features, then that's all you can really rely on. You can't use all the cool bells and whistles that they provide, because they kind of tend to lock you in a bit more. And so it's interesting. What we do see, though, is running different workloads in different clouds to take advantage of the sweet spots, right? I've seen a lot of customers who are basically an AWS shop. They run all their stuff in AWS, but their analytics people are running in Google Cloud. And so they end up moving all this data from AWS's S3 storage into Google Cloud and doing the analytics there. And so it's an interesting idea. It really helps you pick and choose the things you want, right? But very few organizations are really running, hey, I'm running the same workload in multiple clouds, right? If you do want to do that, there are some tools and frameworks that can help make your application a little more cloud agnostic, right? So using something like OpenShift. OpenShift is a framework built on top of Kubernetes, but it basically provides some of the platform as a service that normally you would get from a cloud provider. You get it from the framework. And so I can take this OpenShift application, I can run it in my own data center, I can run it in AWS, I can run it in Azure, I can run it in Google Cloud, and it runs the same in all those places. And I still get some of those platform as a service advantages that I want. But then I'm probably paying Red Hat for a licensed version of OpenShift, right? So then you got extra, costs involved there, right? So there's a few different technologies that can help us be a little more cloud agnostic. This kind of brings me to this idea of, hey, when somebody says we're moving to the cloud, and you got to look and say, okay, well, what do we need to learn, right? What is a cloud journey really? It's rarely just, I'm going to let, this vendor take care of my data center, right? The most basic concept is, okay, instead of me running the data center, I'm going to let a company like AWS or Microsoft or Google that's really good at running and building and scaling and securing data centers, we're going to just rent virtual machines from them, right? If that's all the cloud was, we wouldn't be talking about it so much, right? It's generally a much bigger shift when you say, hey, we're moving to the cloud. What are we really doing? A lot of times these days, we're doing three things at once. So one is, yes, we're starting to use a public cloud provider, right? So we're probably gonna have to learn, how do I launch a virtual machine in AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, right? We are probably further embracing DevOps culture and tools, right? This idea of building small cross-functional teams is very, very popular these days. And saying, let's take this huge monolithic app and break it up into a bunch of microservices. And then we'll have these small cross-functional teams deploying and being in charge of this set of microservices, right? And then how do you implement those microservices? Is it with containers and Kubernetes, or is it maybe serverless using Lambda and API gateway or whatever? And so in the end, what we find is that moving to the cloud can mean having to learn all kinds of new skills and various technologies, right? And so it's sort of one of those things that, we say when somebody comes to me, I talk to a lot of customers and they say, hey, we need to learn the cloud. Well, what do you really mean when you say? And so as a training company, we said, well, we need to sort of show visually, what does it mean to be move to the cloud? What could be involved in that? And so we built this diagram and call it Cloud Centrics. It's the technologies and practices that bring you all the cloud has to offer. And Alexandra just put a link in the chat. Let me just click on that. That takes us to the website, our website, where we talk about it. And in fact, let me just go download this PDF. It's very much an interactive PDF. Let me just pull it over here. Make it full screen, view single page. Okay, there we go. And so what you see is in the middle, we've got public cloud training, right? So ExitCertified, we're partnered with AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft, Oracle, even IBM Cloud, right? So if you want public cloud training from the vendor, authorized training, we've got that, right? But the problem is that isn't the whole picture, right? If you are in this hybrid environment or in multi-cloud environment, what if you're using VMware Cloud on AWS or VMware Cloud on Azure? What if you're using OpenShift or OpenStack or whatever? There's lots of tools out there for private and hybrid cloud or multi-cloud. And so we've got training on those. So we're partnered with VMware. We're sort of the biggest VMware partner in North America. What about containers and cloud native? Well, do you just need sort of architecture training on microservices, or do you want to know more specifically about containers and Kubernetes? What about DevOps and Agile techniques? Sure. What about automation? Because a big part of DevOps is this idea that we want to automate things. Everything we do in the cloud is an API call. That means everything can be scripted, right? So setting up your whole infrastructure. Well, every one of these cloud vendors has some sort of tool for templating and saying, okay, I need to set up a network that looks like this, and I want an auto-scaling group of web servers that look like this, and I need to run these databases. And so you could build a big script, right? In AWS, we have something called CloudFormation. In Azure, we have something called ARM, Azure Resource Manager. And so you have to learn how to do it in each one. Or you go to sort of this cloud agnostic third-party tool called Terraform. And Terraform, you just learn one templating style, and you can template things for private cloud with VMware or any of the public clouds. So you only have to learn one way to do it. So Terraform, Ansible, these are very popular infrastructure as code kind of tools. So we have training on those. What about cloud security? Well, every one of the cloud vendors has, some heavy duty security classes. Obviously, security is a focus when people move to the cloud. But what if I want to go and get some sort of cloud agnostic certification? So there's the CISSP, the CCSP, there's some CompTIA, TIA certifications. And so we have courses to help prep for those. And we talked all about analytics. We said, once you got all this data in the cloud, you're going to start doing analytics. So analytics courses could be simple as, BI tools like Tableau or IBM Cognos or Power BI, but also all that big data stuff, learning Spark. We've got classes from Cloudera and from Databricks. So we're partnered with all these different vendors, even newer ones like Snowflake. And so we've got a lot of different training. And so this is the idea, is that, you know, when somebody comes to me and says, I need cloud training, I've really got to get to the bottom of it and say, do you just want to learn, do you want to take a couple AWS courses, or do you want to learn how to build cloud native apps that run in the cloud? And then maybe your analytics people need to learn more about cloud analytics stuff. And so every one of these, if you click on it, like here, I click on this one, this takes me to the analytics training courses. So there's courses from the major vendors, and then it just keeps going on down. Okay. So that's how we sort of organized our website around this idea of this cloud centrics diagram. All right, I don't have a lot of time left, so I wanted to let Alexandra talk a little bit about the promotion that we have going. So,
thanks, Miles. So yeah, we've kicked off our summer promo this year. It offers up to $500 off public training and up to $500 off per day for private training with the promo code SUMMER500. More than 25 leading vendors such as AWS, VMware, IBM, Mirantis, Microsoft, and more are being offered at a discounted rate when you register by August 29th. So the promotion details can be found at the summer promo link. I've included all of the links on this slide into the chat for you to click on. Another thing to note, you can see the AWS training link. We are also hosting several AWS Discovery Days throughout June and July. Our first is on June 20th. Each Discovery Day will cover a different topic highlighting AWS best practices, excuse me. So if you click on the AWS training link in the chat, you can reserve your seat for the Discovery Days under AWS recommended training.
Yeah, so here, if I click on this Discovery Day, you see the price is free, but you can view the schedule. We have it coming up June 20th, and so you can enroll that way. So there's a few of these Discovery Days. I think we're doing them on Mondays starting June 20th. And then we have 4 of them scheduled. And they're all sort of like a gentle introduction, but they're AWS specifics. Yeah. What else do we have coming up? We have a webinar?
We do, yeah. I can share that in the chat now. We have a How to Fail at Cloud Transformation webinar coming. That's not a clickable link. I can share that actually right now. So we do have that on July 19th.
Yeah, this is from one of our instructors, Ken Kruger. He built this for something specific, and I watched it and I said, this is amazing. This should be standard viewing for anybody who's starting into the cloud. And I said, we need to get him to redo it, you know, for our, you know, publicly for all of our customers. So when is it? It's in July?
July 19th, 11 a.m. It's 1 hour Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah. How to Fail at Cloud Transformation. It's a pretty good one. And then, yeah, like you said, we've got AWS, Azure, Google training. I mean, you can just go to our main page and click on cloud and you'll find all of them, but those are quick links if you're looking for specific stuff. I would say that our biggest schedule is probably AWS, you know, as befitting the market share. We have, you know, probably the most popular class. There's a 1-day Tech Essentials and a 3-day Architecting class. Those, we've got them guaranteed to run every week. Like that's how often we're running them. And when you see that GTR on our website, what that means is that, you know, you can safely book in that, you know, it's not going to be canceled. So it's pretty handy. With Azure, probably the Azure Fundamentals is like a 2-day class. We run that fairly often. And then the Azure Administration, AZ 104 class is very popular. Google Cloud, similar kind of idea. We've got a 1-day Fundamentals class and then a 3-day Architecting class. Those are the most popular ones. All right, we have a little bit of time left if there's questions. By the way, my email address, miles.brown@techdata.com. ExitCertified is part of Tech Data, so that's why you see both those names everywhere. And that's why our email addresses. But ExitCertified is really our go-to-market brand for training. And that's really all we do. We're a training company that's owned by a much bigger distribution company. So yeah, so Alexandra just put my email address in there. That's a good thing to copy down. You may be able to save the chat to get all those links. I think if you hit the ... there's a save chat button. Hopefully that works for you. Doesn't work for everybody. But yeah, if you want to throw questions in the chat, you can certainly do so. Okay, looks like we have. Okay, it looks like we have one question that's asking which cloud is the easiest to learn? I don't know if that's that's a tough question. I would say that, you know, whichever one you learn first is going to be the hardest, right? And certainly both Azure and Google Cloud, they recognize that they're not the market leaders. And so they actually have versions of their courses that are sort of, you know, like if you look in the Google Cloud classes, there's a fundamentals class for AWS professionals. So they're saying, hey, if you already know AWS and you just need to learn what's the differences, we can give you a nice cut down version of the course, right? So I think whichever one you try and learn first is going to be the most difficult. But to be honest, over time, you know, they all, whenever one of them has a good idea, the other ones look and say, oh, we'll try and incorporate that too, right? So over time, they get closer and closer to one another. What I would say is that when you're first learning AWS, they have something called a free tier, but it's very much buyer beware. So you got to be careful, because when you launch stuff, if you just let it sit there and run and run and run, it's, you know, your bill's piling up. Whereas in Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure, they have a free account where basically they won't charge your credit card. They'll stop letting you do stuff when your free credits are gone. So those are a little more friendly for first learning than the AWS one. Any other questions? All right, let me just put this back up, make sure we've got that promo. So this promo is pretty handy. What did we say it was? Oh, it's like however many days the class is. If it's a 1-day class, it's 100 off. If it's 2-day class, it's 200 off.
Yeah, so like,
okay.
Yeah, up to 500.
So up to 500 for a 5-day. Yeah, that makes sense.
Private, and yep.
Yeah, so I would say with AWS, most of the classes are 3-day classes. You know, there's usually a 1-day kind of intro and then a 3-day class. With Microsoft Azure, they tend to be 4-day classes. With all of these classes, we give you access to the labs a little longer, depending on the vendor. But with AWS, we give you access for 3 months to go back and do those labs, so you can try them again. With Azure, depends on the course. Some of them you get a 30-day Azure pass. So, you know, after class, you still have a few weeks where you can come back and do the labs. Google Cloud, it's usually about 2 weeks. So depending on the vendor, but you should have some extra time. And then, of course, the books are yours for good. They've all gone to e-kits, so the books are sort of electronic versions. All right.
Any other questions in the chat, Miles? Or?
No, that's all I saw so far. All right, well, if you have any questions, you've got my email address, miles.brown@techdata.com. It's a good place to ask technical questions. If you have questions more about the training, I might refer you to one of our salespeople. I spend a lot of my time doing sales support kind of, you know, when we have larger opportunities, I work with the customers, like technical people, to find out what exactly do we need to learn, right? Like if, you know, we take it back to that diagram and say, you know, what does your move to the cloud look like, and try and figure out, And instead of just saying, okay, go take course A, B, C, D from your cloud vendor, what do you really need to learn? And so we can definitely set up one of those calls if you've got any kind of needs. But like I said, just send me an email and then I'll loop in your sales rep and we'll get it going. We've got languages training here too. I mean, that's not really cloud, I would say, but there's certainly some newer languages that people are trying to brush up on as well. So just let you know, we have over 9,500 courses on our website. That's not courses that we run regularly, but we've got quite a network of consultants. So when somebody comes to us with some brand new technology XYZ, I might not know it, but we'll figure out who knows it and we'll bring them in and we'll make sure that we can get you whatever training you need. All right, so I think we're probably going to end it at this point. There doesn't seem to be any more questions.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions on my end as well. But I do just want to say thank you, Miles, for providing us with all this valuable info. It was a lot of info. So for anyone that did join the call late, we have recorded this webinar and we will be sending it out tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that follow-up email. But with that said, thank you again, everyone, for joining today.
All right, thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.